Walking the Rainbow by Grace King. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Matt Perard. Walking the Rainbow by Grace King. In spite of the careful attention of friends and the assiduities of talebearers, we live in a woeful state of ignorance as to the true condition of the sentiments of anyone about us, and when we interrogate our own judgment, we get no better enlightenment, for unfortunately we are all addicted to the pleasant habit of counting as friends those whom we like, as enemies those whom we dislike. For that reason alone, and only that reason, Mr. Talbot's memory did not carry Monsieur Pinseau as a friend. The ridiculous attempts at speech-making and the undignified campaign activities in favor of a political trickster that rankled so painfully in the Creole gentleman's remembrances of the past did not trouble the American at all. But the things that Monsieur Pinseau passed over with indulgence, those were the ones that Mr. Talbot's memory recorded with unalterable condemnation. In his own defeat and the triumph of the rival candidate he attributed nothing whatever to Monsieur Pinseau, whom he frankly did not credit with an idea in his head above fast living and extravagant spending of his wife's money, of, in short, playing the fool, as he called it, and of making associates of men who were also given to that pastime. Which shows, among other verities, how much more importance than they deserve we attach to our pitiful efforts to overthrow a good character and reputation. When Mr. Talbot heard his wife's report about Mademoiselle Mimi, he was vastly pleased. "All the money in the world," he said enthusiastically, "could not procure better instruction or instruction that agreed better with his ideas." It was what he had hoped, when he had money with which to realize his hopes. "A lady," he explained, "must furnish example as well as precept to her pupils." His objection to most governesses and teachers was that they were such a warning against themselves, generally an ugly, forlorn, disappointed and soured set of women, with far more of the furies than the graces about them. A teacher should represent to a little girl what she would like to be, for little girls learn by imitation mostly. Mrs. Talbot never contested the opinions of her husband. Her way of entertaining him was to let him talk to her, and to agree with him. As for the reasons of things, she seldom thought of them. The things themselves, she was wont to say, were as much as she could tackle. "Give the little girls a good model," he continued, "and the battle is half won." He would never allow a daughter of his to, emphasizing his meaning, be taught by a man, for she would end by trying to imitate him, and the result would be a hobbledehoy. Mademoiselle could teach all that it was essential for a lady to know, that is, how to take her place in society and maintain it. He smoked his pipe for a few minutes in silence, and his wife knew as well as if he had told her that he was thinking of those old salons on Royal, St. Louis and Chartres streets, where as a young man fresh from the University of Virginia he had met the charming society of the ladies whom he had never ceased to admire and whom he had chosen as the models for his daughters. The only drawback he could see in Mademoiselle Mimi's school was Monsieur Pinseau, and he charged his wife not to encourage any intimacy between the two families. He himself had never wished to know the man, had always avoided him, and he would not suffer his children to be thrown familiarly into company that he disapproved of. If the world were to be made of such as Monsieur Pinseau was reputed to be, There would be no morality and no law in it. He knew personally nothing against him, except that he went with a set of men that flaunted their follies and so demoralized society. It was always easier to prevent than to break off. He thought that Mademoiselle Mimi had better be told this at the outset, firmly and frankly. Then there could be no misunderstanding in the future. He confided to his wife this flaming sword and even instructed her as to how her delicate hands were to wield it. Do not let your politeness get the better of you. Be firm and decided. There is nothing that a mother should be so decided about as the surroundings of her daughters. Mademoiselle Mimi is a sensible woman, and she will understand the importance of maintaining the standards of good society. A man cannot make his assertions in such matters as a woman can. A man represents at best only intellectual force, women spiritual. After a pause he continued. If women chose, they could rule the world through society. We can better get along with a corrupt judiciary than a corrupt society. Do not hurt her feelings, but make your point clear. You can be clear enough when you want. And you had better warn the children a little. Let them understand. Yes. I will depend upon you to manage it. Yes. Do it in your own time and your own way. Ladies have a gift for such things. A smile, a word, no more. But what a rebuke! A volume couldn't tell more, a pistol shot be more killing. He sank deep in his reflections, perhaps over some such pistol shot in his own memory. When there was no alternative between doing his will and being disagreeable, his wife was forced to exercise some of the gifts which she also possessed, in common with the charming ladies of his memory. For as much as he knew about them, she knew more. He saw the outside of their gifts, she the inside machinery. Tell a daughter, she said to herself, that her father is an improper acquaintance for little girls who know nothing against him, and never will know anything against him. Make Mademoiselle Mimi understand that there must be no intercourse between the two families, because, in short, my husband is better than her father. Where? Great heavens, where? In what salons, ancient or modern, did ladies say such things one to another? Perhaps in the wilds of Virginia, where my husband was born, but not here, in Louisiana, where, thank heaven, I was born. If it were the truth, which it is, Mademoiselle Mimi would surely know it better than any one else. How could she help knowing it? What did her whole life mean otherwise? Her misfortunes, her labor, her unselfish devotion. What did it all mean to her, if not just that? But tell her so. Make her understand it, which means to make her acknowledge and confess it. Mademoiselle Mimi would very soon put an end to any such conversation as that. And to save society! Heavens above! Go around denouncing one another's fathers, brothers, husbands! That would be a feasible way of saving it, eh? What society would be left? And what woman would be sure enough of her own father, husband, brother, aye, sister, and even mother? There had been this consideration in some families that she knew of. Go around denouncing this one and that. No, no! Women maintain society by just the opposite plan. Men denounce the criminal, but hold on to the crime. Women denounce the crime, but hold on to the criminal. That is the difference between them. And Mademoiselle Mimi was right, 1,000 times right, as a woman. Husbands, despite their convictions and their superior assumptions to the contrary, have really no advantage over other men in knowledge of a woman's mind, or, in short, of the inner determinations of a wife's mind. They can only know in truth what the wife chooses to tell them, and a discreet wife often chooses to limit her communications of this kind. Wives, for example, such as Mr. Talbot admired in the old salons, who were as unlike missionaries as one can possibly conceive. They were not women to brandish moral swords. They were women, on the contrary, like Mademoiselle Mimi. So Mrs. Talbot was quite clear, in this at least, that Mademoiselle would be talked to as her husband directed at the Greek calends, and not before. The bright glow of sunset shone in the sky. It brightened the spire of the little church, and seemed almost to give a golden tone to the thin, weak voice of the Angelus bell. A few oranges still glittered amid the dark foliage of the hedge, the sour, bitter kind, not the sweet ones whose flowers so poetically used to symbolize the hopes of brides. And the old garden, as an old face does sometimes from inward illumination, flushed under the golden and rose light of the sky into a flicker of its pristine witchery and beauty. The children were scattered through it, fondling and caressing it, as if, indeed, it were an old face. I have never worked for anything in my life that I did not get it in the end. The husband spoke meditatively from another milestone in his thoughts. This was true, but his wife had never heard him say so before. There never had been any need to say it before. It was taken for granted. Now? "But you worked hard for what you wanted," she responded quickly with her sure instinct of affection. "It was always said about you that you were the hardest working young lawyer at the bar. I always remember a story papa told about you. He was passing your office once in the middle of winter, long past midnight, and seeing a light in your office. All the other windows were black. He went upstairs to see if anything were the matter, opened the door, and there you were over your books, dressed just as you had come from some dinner party or ball." "Well, Talbot," he said disgustedly. Her husband took up the story with a laugh. "You must love work." "Love," I answered. "I love it better than meat and bread." His face showed his satisfaction at the memory of it. She possessed the art of recalling such things and repeating them appropriately. Her memory was a treasury to her. She never forgot a face, a name, a good deed, a pleasant speech, or a humorous incident. "Yes," her husband repeated, with gusto, "I always loved to work. I cared in fact for nothing in life that I did not work for. What a man makes up his mind to work for, he can obtain," he added confidently. And then he began to explain his plans again to her. Any one could understand them, they were so simple and natural. It was true he had lost a fortune, everything he had worked for and gained since he had been a lawyer, and he did not count in this what he should have inherited from his father, who had died during the war and whose estate had been settled in Confederate money. He counted as his own only what he had made, and no man had made more or larger fees than his. He called over, as lawyers never tire of doing, his cases in the past and the briefs, the historic briefs, he called them, that he had written. Having saved his library, he said, was the greatest piece of good fortune that could happen to him or any lawyer. If that had been lost, he would have considered himself unfortunate. The loss of his plantation would have been nothing in comparison to it. With its accumulation of private notes and records, it was perhaps the most complete in the city. He knew he would not have exchanged it for any he had ever seen. And he was lucky too in having his same old office. He could take up just where he had left off 4 years ago, and as far as he could see, it was only a question of work, with him, to catch up on the losses of the war. Fortunately, litigation could not be captured, confiscated, or burned. "The fact is," he concluded, with a frank laugh, "if there is any important lawsuit, there are 4 or 5 of us who are bound to be retained on one side or the other." The only change she would make from former plans was that instead of sending his sons to the University of Virginia as he had intended, he would put them to work just as soon as they knew enough of the requisites, that is, Latin, Greek, and mathematics, with sufficient science for respectability, which was far more than the greatest Americans had started with 50 years ago. If there was anything in the boys, they could get along on the education he was able to give them. If they could not get along on that, it was a pretty good sign they would not get along on a better. The daughters would suffer less in education, for they could learn easier all that ladies needed to know, and take more time over it. He had always counted on giving each one of her dower when she became of age, so that she could marry or not just as she chose. He had seen some unfortunate young girls marry for money, some literally for the means of living. A dower, he feared, would be beyond his reach now. The consequences of the war would fall heavier on the women than on the men. The lives of the men would be changed comparatively little. But the women! It was slavery alone that had kept them from domestic drudgery. He shook his head and repeated, "Domestic drudgery added to family duties." He smoked his pipe a moment, and continued with a new variation of his subject, his wife listening without assent or dissent, looking through his telescope whichever way he wanted, either end the right one for her. He ran over the list of his friends, who like him had broken away from all that had constituted life to them to go into the war. As he gave the name, his wife's ready memory supplied her usual pleasant addenda of reminiscences. How they used to like this one and that one, and how this one and that one used to like him and praise him to her, and all sorts of other items in connection with his friends that he had forgotten, tossing over her little memories and rummaging in them as she once would have done in her great bureau drawer of scraps. And like the lady's scraps of that time, her bits from memory were all of beautiful quality: silk, velvet, brocade, real embroidery, real lace, buttons and buckles that looked like jewelry, ribbons, ostrich and marabou feathers, all too pretty to throw away, but so useless to keep except as souvenirs. The duel that he had prevented, the ugly family quarrel he had stopped, a reconciliation between a husband and wife bent on divorce, the last will and testament he had turned from resentment into forgiveness of injuries, and how he had always stood by the unfortunate. There was not a friend or client he could name that she could not connect with some personal obligation. It was only the good lawyer's usual showing at that time, and the wife's usual version of his services, services that only lawyers and their wives enhance with any glamour of sentimental obligation, for a lawyer's clients have no such glamour in their view of the transaction. But it was a pleasant review and a drawer of scraps that any lawyer's wife would be glad to own. Even old Benton, millionaire and miser that he was, had owned to her that the beginning of his great fortune was laid when Talbot was a young law student, and he, Benton, a porter carrying bundles of goods on his back up and down 4 and 5 flights of stairs. And there was Tommy Cook, whom he had picked up out of the gutter, for he could never see a bright boy run to waste without stretching out his hand to prevent it. And and friends, friends, friends. Wherever they looked in the past they saw friends and not an enemy. For, according to the pleasant weakness already mentioned, they saw in the past none to whom they were not friendly, forgetting, of course, contradictory experiences. "I shall let Tommy Cook keep his desk in the office." "What does he want with the desk there?" the wife asked innocently. "Well, not to black shoes on, you may be sure. Tommy is a lawyer now." "How can he be a lawyer?" "By study and work, like other men." "But I always thought that lawyers had to be gentlemen." "I have never known a lawyer who was not a gentleman." "You have been very lucky, then," he answered dryly. There was silence between them for a moment, and then he took up the fallen thread of conversation again. "He has a pretty good practice already. He gained a suit for Benton the other day." "What? Did Benton employ him?" "He needed a lawyer, and Tommy is about as decent a one as he could find. He has been associated, at least, with the bar." "Yes, as a bootblack. Some of the others wouldn't have made even decent bootblacks. Butlers and camp followers mostly." She looked disgusted, but said nothing. "What?" she asked, brightening with a sudden inspiration. "What has become of the Riparian case?" Always before, that is before the war that had separated them from their past, in their talks about the future they would discuss this case. She had completely forgotten it. What a prominent object it had always been in her husband's horizon. For years his ambition had rested on it. It was to be, in his eyes, the masterpiece of his profession, to give him fame throughout the legal world. He used to say that if he never gained anything else but that one case he would have secured wealth for himself and his children, so far reaching would be the effects of a favorable decision. The fee was contingent, but he was as sure of getting it, he used to say, as he was sure the heavens would not fall. From the time that he had been called to the bar he had aimed at that case. He had studied and worked his way into it with such consummate patience and legal keenness that he was considered the only man in the city who had a perfect record of it in his mind. It was as much his own as any piece of property he could have bought. No matter when it was opened, now or 20 years hence, it could not be opened without his appearing in it as principal counsel. How strange, thought the wife, that everything else should give way in the South, government, states' rights, social order, and that a great war should be fought and thousands of lives lost, and a mere question of the city's riparian rights should survive. That like a lighthouse it should still be standing after the storm that has strewn the shore with wrecks. This led her to ask about their friend Dalton, who, having studied law in her husband's office, had been employed in some minor capacity in this very riparian case. "Dalton? Oh, Dalton went into the war a private, and has come out a major." "Well, is he any more human? Any less like a fish, cold and slippery?" As she had done about the Riparian case, her husband might well have wondered how such an idle and futile prejudice could survive the fierce tempest that had almost engulfed the national government, and wrecked its apparently indestructible fortunes. He answered quietly: "He is very much improved in appearance and seems full of energy. He will stay in my office and use my library until he is able to set up an independent establishment." A click of the gate's latchet caused them to raise their heads and look in that direction, and as they saw who was coming down the walk toward them, both exclaimed, "Harry Linton!" Both stepped forward to meet him, the aunt repeating with a glad smile, "Harry! Harry! I was thinking about him only to day." She had not seen him since he waved his cap in good by to her from the car window when his company left for Virginia. The gay young nephew who had lived with them while he studied law with his uncle, whom he loved, it may be said, for his faults, for he had made no display of the family virtues. He was still boyish looking, and had still the same old irresistible expression of friendliness and good humor on his round, freckled face, and in his blue eyes, and his light hair stood out as it used to in thick curls over his head. The only change was a long, ugly scar that extended over one side of his face, from forehead to chin, cutting across an eye. He looked taller, and showed the effect of drilling in his bearing, but he was still shorter than his uncle by a full head. They drew their chairs together, the children clustering on the steps in good hearing. "Well," said his uncle, "what are you doing?" "No, no," protested the aunt. He must begin from the time he left us and tell us all his adventures. I want to hear the whole story from beginning to end." The young fellow laughed and told hurriedly how, after he was wounded in Virginia, he had been sent back to Louisiana to recuperate, and then had been transferred to the Louisiana command where, in a desperate fight on Red River, a small company tried to delay the advance of the Federal army, which they succeeded in doing; how he received his wound in the face, and was insensible when he was taken prisoner and brought to New Orleans. After he was discharged from the hospital, he was kept in prison until peace was declared. The children crowded upon one another to get nearer to him while he talked along in his gay, bright, reckless way. "As soon as I could get out of the city," he continued, "I started for home. I hadn't heard a word from my people for a year, and didn't know anything about them, except that they had taken refuge in Texas. You know, our place was just on the line of Banks' March." His uncle nodded. "And then? And then?" His aunt's voice quivered with impatience. "The chimneys are still standing, and that is all that was left to show that there had been a human habitation there." "Oh! oh!" wailed the aunt. "That beautiful old house, that fine plantation." Harry was too much amused at the story to come to waste time on the lament. He threw his head back and laughed as at a joke. "Ha, ha! I wish you could have seen the family come back. I was lucky enough to get there the day before. I camped during the night in the shelter of my ancestral ruins, that is, in the furnace of the sugar house. There were not enough ruins of anything else to shelter a cat," laughing. "I knew they would come straight to the place as quick as they could travel, and I had a presentiment that that would be about as quick as I could get there from the city. Well, I was standing in front of my furnace, looking about for something to look at, when here they came, just about dusk. First a broken down buggy tied with a rope, drawn by a limping horse. Elizabeth was in it with Heatherstone. Behind them came a little cart with a kind of cover over it, drawn by an old gray mule. Mother drove that, and it seemed filled with children. Their heads stuck out in all directions, like chickens in a basket." All laughed with him at this picture. "Heatherstone was shot all to pieces at Mansfield, you know. I had heard that he was wounded, but I really did not know until I saw him that he had lost both an arm and a leg." "An arm and a leg! Oh, Harry!" cried his aunt in horror. "Yes, and on the hand he has left he has only three fingers. The thumb and forefinger had to be amputated." "Oh, how does he stand it?" asked the uncle, curtly interrupting the soft, sympathetic voice. "He was the last man in the country to play the invalid with success." "Invalid? He an invalid? Whew!" Harry threw back his head and whistled. "I was fool enough to think I might say something to him, to show a little feeling, to express some sort of sympathy and that sort of thing about his being a cripple. By Jove!" The young man jumped up to act the scene for them. He turned upon me as if I were a Yankee. "Damn it, sir, do you dare sympathize with me, sir? Damn your sympathy! I don't want any man's damned sympathy. Take your damned sympathy where it is needed, sir. We don't need it here, sir." He was a capital mimic, and did the scene so well that one saw the tall gaunt figure of his Texan brother in law, as well as heard him snarling out his short sentences. "I will let you know, sir, I am as good a man now, sir, as I ever was. I can do without my leg, sir, and my arm, sir. The Yankees are welcome to them, sir, damn them. My wife, sir, doesn't need them either. My wife, sir, at this moment is worth more than any 100 damn Yankees I ever came across, sir. They didn't shoot off her leg, sir, or her arm, and you needn't go offering her any of your damn sympathy either, sir. She doesn't need it." And I took his advice. I didn't sympathize any more with any of them. You would never recognize Elizabeth. She goes stalking about in a pair of her husband's old cavalry boots, and an old hat of his, and she ties her skirts up to her knees like the negro women used to do in the fields, and she wears a pistol stuck in her belt. In fact, she does everything she can to make a man out of herself except curse and smoke. And the more of a man she is, the better her husband likes it. The two are always together. Mother takes care of the children. How is your mother?" Harry sat down and laughed at this memory also. "Mother is not changed a particle, not a shade. She goes stepping around in her old faded calico dress and sunbonnet, just exactly as she used to at Princeton in that ugly old India shawl of hers and bird of paradise bonnet. She is just as unbending, just as firm, just as sure of herself, and she keeps Heatherstone, that's the eldest boy, under her thumb just as she used to do me. Makes him study of nights, and tells him what great things she expects of him, exactly as she used to do with me. Not one of them will own to being hurt by the results of the war. They pooh their losses. In fact, they live as if the Yankees were watching and listening to them all the time, and they will die before they gratify them with a regret. I found out, seeing that his audience was waiting in silence for more on the subject, that mother and sister had about $50 in gold." "$50 in gold!" his aunt exclaimed in amazement, as if it were a fortune. "Yes, $50 in gold." "How did they manage to save so much?" "They didn't save it," pausing to enhance his effect. "They made it." "Made it!" ejaculated the aunt in still greater amazement. "How could they make money?" "How could they make it?" For the first time his voice was grave. "Why, they were in some God forsaken place in Texas where the children were hungry for food and cold for clothes, and they had to make money or beg." "But what could they do?" "They knit, they spun, they cooked," lowering his voice and speaking slower. "They took in washing and ironing, and they planted a little cotton, only a few rows, for the knitting, you know, and at the end of the war they had a little pile of it stuffed into their mattresses. Of course it was good as gold, and when Heatherstone returned to them he came in a buggy with an old broken down army horse that the commissary department allowed him, as it was the only way he could travel. The cart and the mule he managed to pick up somewhere. I believe he gave one of his pistols for them." "How many children had they?" asked his aunt. "Five. They lost two. Heatherstone, the eldest, is a fine boy." "You did not make up your mind to stay with them?" asked his uncle. "The fact is, uncle, when I went there it was to stay with them and work on the old plantation, and when I saw Heatherstone I was determined to do so, for I never felt so sorry for people in my life," looking at his uncle and then at his aunt, "as when I saw them unloading themselves from their buggy and cart. I could have stayed willingly with them and worked like a negro for them the rest of my days, but they wouldn't hear of such a thing, grew indignant at the very idea of it. Heatherstone seemed to take it as a reflection on himself and sister, and mother waxed eloquent over my duty to become a great lawyer and chief justice of the state, just as she used to do when we all had fortunes. They camped out that night, as they had done nearly every night of their journey from Texas, but by noon the next day they were having a shelter put up around one of the old chimneys. Heatherstone and Elizabeth had gone out about daylight and rooted up some of the old negroes somewhere, and found the lumber. They said they could put up a very comfortable cabin for the $50, and began at once to talk about a garden, chickens, and 10 acres of cotton. I suppose Heatherstone, the boy, will do the plowing when they get a plow, and I have not the slightest doubt but that mother and Elizabeth will help in the hoeing, and of course all, down to the youngest, will take a hand in the picking." In spite of his natural high spirits and his fondness for laughing at his people, his voice grew sad. "As they didn't seem to have thought of me in any of their plans, and in fact, so far as I could see, didn't need me or want me, I concluded that the thing for me to do was to come back to the city and see if I could not make a little money here. They will need ready money, and that badly, long before spring, if I am not much mistaken." "Well," said his uncle reflectively, "I do not know but what you are right. You selected the bar for your profession, studied for it, and were admitted. I do not see any good reason why you should throw away all the time, work, and expense you gave to it. Your 4 years of soldiering ought not to make you a worse lawyer. On the contrary, it ought to make you a better one." He smoked a few shifts from his pipe and concluded with: "And I have always thought, Harry, you ought to make a pretty good lawyer of yourself." "I believe myself," said the young fellow, rising, "that I could at least make a living for my mother and myself at it, if I had a fair chance. There is no telling, however, what the outcome of all this is going to be," he added, with rather a questioning look at his uncle. "Oh," was the answer, "I fancy the country will soon settle down and go to work to repair the losses. That is what I'm going to do," with a frank laugh. "I had thought," the young fellow hesitated, glancing furtively at his aunt as he used to do in critical ventures with his uncle, "I had thought of trying something else, to make money a little quicker. Times are changed." "But we are not." "I don't know about that, uncle." "But I do know. I might get a clerkship somewhere." "A clerkship!" "Well, it would give me some money at once." The mother hastily gathered her children together. "It is their bedtime," she explained with a cheerful voice, but trying to make her nephew see her warning shake of the head. "He is no wiser about getting along with his uncle than he was before he went to the war," she said to herself as she left the gallery. But looking back from the room, she saw the two men walking together down the path to the gate, the elder one turning his head toward the younger one, and she knew, as well as if she heard the words, that some of the funds brought by the Herald of Prosperity was to be dispatched at once to the cabin built around the chimney of the ruined plantation. End of Walking the Rainbow, by Grace King, from The Pleasant Ways of St. Medard.